Okay, hello there everybody. This is our second monthly vector deep dive, and today I am joined by Cody Murray from here in Albuquerque, and Steve Turner way over in Melbourne, and Brian Horsfield from Colorado. Is that Boulder?
It is Boulder, yeah.
Okay. So we got lots of cool stuff to cover for everybody today. Thanks for tuning in. I'm going to start with a couple simple demos, and then Steve is going to take those a little further. Kind of the theme today are the control page and sequence rates, and some of the less well-used rates. Kind of show you a way to get into those. So let me switch over to, and then after we're done with that, Brian's going to take over as the Aefonic, and he's going to give us a tour of his system. Nice performance. We're really looking forward to that. And then we'll do a nice long Q&A session, talk about his system, how he's been working with the vector. And then we'll kind of open things up, right? We'll have people on the chat line are tuning in already, and we'll be taking questions from the chat line and talking about a lot of different things. All right, so let me tune on over to my demo system and wake this up. So I'm going to talk about the rate modes, and in particular some unusual rate modes. Let me get my preset back where I need it. So the standard rate modes are the MDV one, and all the usual musical divisions here, 16th notes being the default, 8th note triplets and so forth. Everybody's generally familiar with those. There are a couple of unusual modes, percent and speed. Percent is percent of a beat, and speed is a speed mode where higher numbers are faster, with a rate of 16 set up to be 16th notes. So I'm going to start this sequence up. It's just a simple 3-note arpeggiated chord. I'm going to start playing around with the speed mode, just turning it up. Slow it down. So this is not going to be related to the standard musical grid other than when you're at speed 16. Percent mode is similar. 20, in this case it's percent of a beat, so 25 corresponds to a 16th note. And when you turn it down, you're getting faster and slower as it increases. And then there are two sets of 3 modes I want to talk about in more detail. The crossfade modes, of which there is X16, X8T or 8th note triplets, and X8 for 8th notes, X16 being for 16th notes. These are called the crossfade modes, and the rate runs from 0 up to 100, and then back down to minus 100. Go all the way down there. I realize this is a case where having some shift knob control could be really handy on this one. And at its fastest rate, a rate of 100, it becomes 32nd notes. So let's let this run. I'm going to start up a second part.
Hey Jim, when you get a set, go to full screen if you don't mind, so we can get a better view.
I always forget that.
Thanks.
There we go. So part 3 is also just a 3-note chord. In fact, it's the same chord. Go back to part 1. I'm going to start dialing up X16. See, they quickly go out of phase. Part 1 gets faster and faster. Now it's at 32nd notes. And then one trick that's very handy when you're working with phasing stuff is to hold Shift and the previous button. And in the next bar line, it will reset all sequencers on the vector, which can bring them back into sync. So let's say I dial this back down to 0. hold Shift and Previous, and they resync on the bar line.
And yeah, that's a great function. It's one that got me because you actually do need to hold Shift and Previous over the bar line, not just press it and release, but press it, hold it, bar
yeah,
line.
And that way, if you've got most of your parts are actually, you know, pretty much in time with a standard musical division, and you've got a couple that are unusual like this, resetting on the bar line just makes it sound cleaner for all involved. So also, in addition to the crossfade modes, we have the phase modes. And again, there are 3 of them. There's phase 16, phase 8 triplet, and phase 8th note. And these are very similar to crossfade modes, but they have a much, much narrower range. In fact, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but I'm going to set up, I'm going to reset this pattern and run it. And again, same notes, same pattern on 2 parts. Part 3 is in a phase mode, but I'm going to leave it at 0, so only part 1 is the one that's going to be changing. And I'm going to set the rate at 10, and it will very slowly move out of phase, and then I'll probably bring it up to 19 after a bit, and then back into phase. So you start with just a flanging effect and then a slight delay. Now they're almost completely out of phase. Coming back into phase. And of course, they won't stay back in phase. They'll go right back out of phase again. So one way to resolve this is bring the rate back down to 0 and reset on the bar line. And there are lots of interesting little tricks, so you can pull them out of phase, kind of by ear to where you like it, and bring the rate back down to 0. They'll stay out of phase. You can use the reset function. And this will force a reset every so many beats, so in this case 4 beats. So you can start playing games where you send them out of phase and then bring them back into phase. Okay, so those are the phase modes. Another trick, and let me bring up my preset for this just to remind myself. So in this case, I've got percent mode again. It's back to percent mode, not a phase mode. And I have some modulation on it, so I'm going to quickly turn both modulation sources off. And again, this is percent of a beat. So at 25. And in this case also, it's just straight C's in 16th notes as they're running here, and with a short gate. And I'm going to reduce the rate, which means it'll run faster.
That's very cool.
Yeah, it's a fun trick, and of course it's fun to automate it, right? Just kind of play around like this. So I'm going to go to the modulation tab. I'm going to use some external modulation. I got 2 modulation sources plugged in. Mod 1 is just a noise source with some attenuation on it, and that moves things around quite a bit. In fact, I have to turn it down a bit with the amount, so the amount's only at 20%. I can turn the amount up and get it more and more irregular. bring the envelopes down, get it to kind of more of a Geiger counter type of sound. I can dial this back a little bit, and then have my second modulation source, which is a triangle wave LFO. And you can just kind of use, so I'm using two external modulation sources on a single parameter. Just kind of play around, dial in the sound you like.
And you've got this set to 2 melodic parts here, or 3 sort of, but you could really be using this little function for kind of anything. It could be pinging a filter or doing all kinds of things in or out of phase with whatever else is going on.
Yeah, absolutely. One trick that would be fun is to send like the velocity output to a filter cutoff or to a timbral control, or even do that with pitch. So you have a more percussive sound where you're dialing in the pitch directly, but you can use the pitch output on the vector to affect some modulation sources. And with the rate so weird like this, you'll get a lot of interesting burbling type effects. And then of course, Steve, your example is using primarily drum sounds. Yeah,
definitely. Just a couple of people have mentioned, is this a new function? But my recollection is that this had been, obviously it's something that's easy to overlook because until you sort of point it out, you go, oh, that's actually really musically useful. If you think about other modules like the mutable instruments, marbles, it's kind of got that kind of in and out of phase triggering effect. But this you can do with the whole melodic and velocity sequences as well. Steve Turner in the chat just wants to ask you, Jim, so what was the origin of you coming up with this idea for the vector? Because that's a leading question.
Well, so many years ago, I got to meet Morton Subotnick at a little workshop in Santa Fe called Technik und Eros. And here's one of my original Subotnick vinyls, usually sits on the shelf behind me. And I believe in this piece of a sky of cloudless sulfur, as well as the very well-known Silver Apples of the Moon. And Mort told me about this. I got to have a kind of a sit-down and talk about his music for a while. He did them on the Buchla 100 system, the original Buchla, and he used for tempo sources a technique called flutter tonguing, and he would flutter tongue into a microphone, record that to tape, take the sound of the tape and use it as a CV signal into the modular. And that is how both of those pieces have a very characteristic kind of burbling, moving along, this very kind of alive, non-grid based tempo to them. And in case anybody who doesn't know, flutter tonguing is, if I remember correctly, is basically where you're just moving your tongue quickly against the roof of your mouth, like, and so yeah, that's kind of the first time I met Mort when he lived in Santa Fe. And that and that's kind of how these rate modes came into being, is when I was working on numerology early on, and when it's like, well, we don't just have to move according to musical grid notes, we can have non-grid based movement. And both speed and percent kind of came about, I don't know, just different ways to try and see what came up with interesting measurements, to change the parameter. And then the phase and the crossfade mode came, I think we had those sometime last summer. I think it is part of the 2.0 development scheme. And I was talking to someone at Superbooth who likes to use the speed and percent modes but wanted finer grain control. And I started with the crossfade modes, going, okay, we can go from a 30-second note to a 16th to an 8th note in one range, and then have a triplet-based mode and then a slower mode, and started playing around. And you can get some nice results with this, but if you really want kind of a Steve Reich style phasing where they're very slowly moving in and out of phase, then the phase modes are the way to go because they have a much, much narrower range.
So if I wanted to patch this per se, like walk me through like the basic, I've got an oscillator, a filter, a VCA times two. Like how are you routing to get the crossfade from part to part?
Okay.
In a simple term, if you don't mind.
Right, right. So the crossfade is just in terms of the speed, right? The crossfade is between different speeds. But I'll walk through my patch, which despite the plethora of cables, many of which are not in use right now, on part one, get back to my main demo preset here, it's a 3-step sequence. This trick usually works best when you have two patterns that are either the same or very similar. So I went for a super simple pattern that was duplicated between the two parts. So 3 steps and an arpeggiated minor chord, C, G, E flat, or it would be C, E flat, G if you're writing it out in order that you would play them on a keyboard typically. So that's part one. And then the same sequence again on part 3, C, G, E flat. Nominally both running at 16th notes. I brought the tempo down a bit again so that it's a little easier to hear the phasing at that tempo. And then the two voices are on my system, pitch, gate, and velocity 1 for part 1, and pitch and gate for part 3 on the expander going over to AGH 2 oscillator system on the left. And part 1 is an AGH oscillator. The Dixie is an LFO I'm not using for this demo. Through the dot mix, which is a CP3 type Moog mixer with a little bit of saturation when you turn it up, and an SEM filter. 2 envelopes on the quadra, so that's part 1. Part 3 is, you can't quite see the whole system, but there are 2 AJH oscillators over here mixed into the filter and with their contour generators.
Wonderful. That's super helpful, because I could go back and look at this and try to patch together a couple of things in my system to test something out. It's nice.
Yeah, so the trick is to find a pattern that, or 2 patterns that phase well against each other. And I'd say start with very short percussive type of sound, limited tonal range. In this case, I went for a minor chord, so just 3 notes. And if you want some inspiration, look at Steve Reich's music, particularly drumming, which I think the melody, again, the main melody is quite simple, but then the permutations and the phasing and all the tricks they do, it's really brings it out. And yeah, it's a fun trick. It's a little harder to incorporate it into larger composition but that's also fun. I've done that before. And when I did that in another composition, I actually used 3 parts. Each was just a single note, but each part had a different note. So the 3 parts together made a chord, and I sent it to a MIDI synthesizer in case a Prologue, which is just hiding under this shelf. And that was a lot of fun because when it started the piece, you would have the 3 notes of the chord playing in time with each other, and then they would slowly go out of phase and then come back in phase, and then I'd slowly change the notes in the chord. So that was a really fun process to work with compositionally.
And that sounds great for setting up like a long drone developing piece, experimenting with tempos and using this kind of phasing tricks would be incredible for stacking different waveforms on top of each other over long evolutions. I like the sound of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really nice way to, again, get off the grid, right? I remember at Super Booth last year before, it's almost 2 years ago now, people would say, can I use the vector to get off the grid? I'm like, you can totally get off the grid. You can get way, way off the grid. Of course, if you want to mostly stay on the grid and just nudge things around, then the groove section is the place to do that. But for this demo, we're going way off, completely different set of divisions than the normal musical divisions.
So if I wanted to integrate something like the generate features on part 1, and that made a nice bass line sequence or something percussive, and then generate on part 2 the thing to phase against, it would automatically be in key and probably generate something relatively pleasing right out the gate then.
Yeah, I think so. Or, what might also work is to just generate something on part one
Hmm.
until you find something you like that's simple, and then copy that preset directly to another part
Oh,
and set up your phasing there, and then
Yeah.
just kind of live with that for a little while, right? And then once
A
you
neat
get a
trick
feel
to.
for,
Sorry, Jim.
yeah, go ahead, Steve. Steve, can you
A neat
switch to
trick.
your head cam?
I can. You talk, and I'll do that.
Okay. Um, you want to stick with simple patterns to start, and probably leave off percussion or separate other parts in percussion till you get a feel for how it works. And then
Yeah. So, sorry, a good step to do is if you come up with one pattern, say it's 5 or 8 or whatever steps, copy that from one, copy that preset from one part to another, and in the second part, use the shift and shift left or shift right functions to kind of offset them as well. So you can have
yeah, yeah,
your second part starting on step 3 and the first one starting on step 1, and all of a sudden you're kind of back in the King Crimson discipline era,
yeah.
because that was a major composition tool that those guys used, also influenced by Steve Reich as well. But I think having a known quantity that you're comfortable with, that you've sat with as a melody or a part, and then starting to do the phasing stuff works well, because you start making more informed decisions about what you're
Mhm.
doing.
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. The copy and paste is going to speed up that process significantly. And it looks like page 25 of the new manual covers it pretty nicely.
Yeah, so let me flip back over to the system real quick and just show the copy and paste trick. So I've got part one, preset AO2, which is in the fourth slot, is the one I want to copy. And this key's changed about a month or so ago in the version, the 1.9x betas. Used to be shift select and shift skip. I moved it to edit select and edit skip. So edit select is copy. So hold down edit, press select, and the display will show you've copied something. I can now go over to part 3, and I'm going to pick an empty slot. It's going to be the same preset name, but edit and skip to paste it in. And then while we're here, something I'd been thinking about was, I was munging around with different presets in a new composition, and it seems like it'd be kind of handy to do edit select to copy, and while you hold the edit button down, press one of the Y keys to select a new preset and copy it in directly. And that way, when you're doing the copy, you don't get any changes in the sound. Because right now, if I want to copy AO2 to a slot over here, I have to select the slot and then paste it. And if you're in the middle of something and you don't want the music to stop, that becomes a problem. So anyway, just something I thought of that try to squeeze in after 2.0 is finally totally finished. Soon, real soon now.
You've got so
Hey,
many.
so,
You've got so many fans that you're accommodating for. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And and just on that subject, one last thing, feature-wise, to sneak in is a change to scene behavior, so that and any of you who've worked with scenes know this pretty well, is when you stop the vector, it always jumps back to scene 1. And a few weeks ago, I fixed a bug where it would jump back to scene 1 and overwrite some of the presets if you changed them. So that's fixed. But now I'm adding a preference so that when you stop the sequence, it will leave the scene where it is. It won't change scenes. So you can be working through something, stop the sequence on scene 7 or 8, make some changes, do whatever you need to do, and then start it again. It'll start in that same scene.
great. Hey, Jim, Chris Myers asked a question. Daniel Miller, was it Daniel Miller at Superbooth that was performing using some of that concept?
I seem to remember he was doing that trick quite a bit. Yes.
Yeah, neat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really interesting trick. It takes a while to kind of figure out how to fit it into whichever kind of music you're making, but very useful. And yeah.
Sorry, a question from Shanda Travasi. How do you change the name of the preset?
Ah, okay. So back
It's a
to
good question.
the
Yeah,
system.
these are game changers for me for executing things with speed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's something I'm always, you know, keeping an eye on, right? Is these little usability things really add up and make a difference. All right, so I've got a preset here, and I want to change the name. There's a slightly hidden page called the preset edit page, which I got to using the previous button. And the reason it's slightly hidden is that um, scene and preset are both on the same blue button, and it's easy to get back and forth between them. And these are both pages that you often want to get to quickly. So instead of having a third page for preset edit, it's slightly off the beaten path, so to speak. So preset edit is where you set up your playlist over on the right hand side, and on the left is where you name things. So this is preset number 5. It's the one in the 5th slot, and the name is AO2, so I can change it to be AO5 or BO5 or whatever. And a couple little naming tricks that apply here as well as for part names and project names. You can hold down the shift key and it will dial through vowels, which is a very nice way to move through the alphabet quickly. So if I want to go to
I didn't know that.
I, J, K, L, so I want to go to L, or let's say D, right? So actually surprisingly well how well that works. Anyway, and then the playlist is over here. We covered that a bit last time, if I remember. Okay, any more questions before we head over to Steve?
I think that's it for now.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to take my eyes off the chat and remove my morning head from the camera, so you should be able to just see the vector at the moment. And all right, look, thanks very much for that, Jim. That was really great. I actually learned a couple of things watching that too. So
Great.
thank you very much, and also thanks for the questions, guys. Everyone in the chat, great to see you. I'm going to be going through something that's a little bit more, I guess, standard than what Jim did. I'm going to be starting off just running a couple of drum sounds, and then I'll be moving to a melodic part as well. Now, I've just got my vector set up with 2 parts active at the moment. One is a snare sound and one is a hi-hat sound, because I just want to demonstrate a couple of the musical division functions as ratios that the vector can do as well. So what I've got at the moment is this beautiful sounding pattern that sounds like 16th notes. Okay, so when you begin a preset on the vector, as you'll all know, it defaults to a rate of 16th notes in the musical division mode. Okay, so what I'm going to do is select part 1, and I'm going to dial encoder 6 to the right until we get to the rate and mode function. Okay, so now it's 1 over 1, and I'll let you know, I'll just show you what that sounds like. So now what we've got is the hi-hat happening every 4 snares. So it's effectively become a quarter note. So the rate equals a beat, and a beat in this context is a quarter note. And for every beat, it's going to hit 1 time. So let me go to part 2 and do the same thing to get rid of that machine gun sound. And now both parts will be playing the same division. Now the reason I showed you that is just to sort of take it away from the standard context of a default preset, which is 16th, and I've just moved it to quarters because it's going to be easier to show you some of the other things. So if I've got in part, actually I've got a part 2, part 1. So if I've got 1 and 1, we know that that's one beat or 1 hit per quarter note. So 1 in the time of 1. Now if I make that to mode 2, right? So it's a half note, or 2 in the time of 1. If I make it to mode 3, guess what's going to happen? It's going to be triplets. Right? And of course, when I hit mode 4, I should be using that reset function that Jim showed us before, but I'm only using... Right, so I've got 16ths there, so that's quarter of a quarter note, being a 16th. So remember that the 1 beat is a quarter note, and I've divided that by 4, so it becomes like a 16th. So I'm just showing you the very basic relationship between the ratios of rate and mode. So now, what I'm going to do, which I find pretty interesting, is firstly, I'm going to change this to rate 2, and I'm going to change this to rate 3, and we're going to get something a bit more fun. So this is going to be, hang on, let me do that. So that's 3 hi-hats.
Yeah, 2 versus 3 polyrhythm.
Yeah, so I've got 3 hi-hats in the time of 2 snares, basically. So in the time of 2 quarter notes, I'm getting the triplets over 2 there. So it's kind of like a tuplet kind of feel. So if I extend that and I change this to mode 4, it's going to go back to a snap boring, well, not boring, but it's going to go back to a standard timing thing, so out of a tuplet feel. Right? That's easy. Let's go to 5. Let me change the length to 5 so it's more visibly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's fun. I at least think it's fun. This is how I spend my time. We can then change that to 6 and it becomes even back to a predictable metric again. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep.
That's great for creating accents and rolls and just all these nice polyrhythms. I like it. It's awesome.
That's 7 over 2. Oh, anyway, I spent a lot of time preparing for this, just listening, and it's good fun. I wish I'd had this back in uni 20 years ago. Jim, why didn't you invent this 20 years ago? So that it made my study somewhat easier at the time. So now what I'm going to do is change things a little bit. I'm going to go back to my, what do I want to do? I want to go 5 over 4. This is one of my favorite sort of timings, and we'll go back to length of 5. That's 5 over 4, so 5 in the time of 4, I think of that. You've got bands like Tool, King Crimson, and the guys with the t-shirt I'm wearing at the moment, Cynic, who do a lot of this sort of stuff, which is really good fun. Now, what I'm going to do to make it a little bit more interesting is go to the modulation section for part 1, and I'm going to go to external, whoops, I've just gone past it, external modulation. I'm going to go to external modulation input mod 1, I'm going to turn my maths channel on, and we're going to dial this back a bit. And what I've done is I've got it selecting gate. So instead of playing every one of the 5th divisions, it's only going to play some of them based on how I do it. To add a bit more interest, I'm going to put a ratchet on 2 and 5. So I've just done a few small things to change the pattern here. I'm going to hit go. I've got my LFO going. Let's hope that it makes an impact. So you can hear it's not playing every trigger anymore. It's depending on the modulation and the gate, which I can then, I guess, kind of similar to attenuating using the amount. Anyway, you get the picture with that. It's pretty good fun to sort of set these things up and just let them go. Now, how would that sound if it was a melodic part? Well, let's find out. I'm going to take one of the hits out from my rample, and I'm going to plug it straight into, excuse the camera banging, the gate in on my Tone Star 2600. And I'm going to go back to part, preset. Here's one I prepared earlier. And I'm going to mute that, and let's just have a listen. All right, so that's what I'm playing with. And now I'm going to go back to part, unmute part 8, and we're going to hear a drum beat with that melodic part, and then I'm going to mess around with the melodic part to show you kind of how you might use it in a very basic musical way. So off we go. Now there's a really fun thing you can do by changing the length to say 7 and then having reset. Can you hear that it's kind of stuttering occasionally because the numbers of the metrics here are just, I need Excel to work it out. But
That's wonderful.
But you can see what I'm saying. You're causing the pattern, a predictable pattern, to become really not predictable anymore.
But it still stays. It still
but
stays
I'm still completely controlling it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I have complete control over what's going on, regardless of that. So what I'm going to do now is just another modulation here, because this is, why not? I've got external 2 coming in from my maths LFO, channel 4. I'll just hit the cycle button on that. And I got the great little pitch target here, which is one of my favorite fun things to do. When you come up with a melody, you just throw a whole bunch of other modulation at it. And what that's going to sound like, muting the part again, the drum part. So we just got the melody again. Oops, I've got to get some... Right, so I've made a pretty dramatic impact on that melody. I could fine-tune the LFO if I was going to do that, but let's get the drums back in. Okay, well, that's cool, but another thing you can do is go to your dashboard by hitting part and then encoder 9 to sort of dial to the right. I can start modulating the length of part 1. Okay. Okay, so we go back to part, start. Now what you can see here in the dashboard is you can control the rate and the mode, which are the ratio settings for the timings that we're using. So looking at part 1, I can just be using the dashboard. Alright, what if I wanted to go over to the drum part and change that?
How wonderful for live improving.
Yeah, I was about to say this is great for getting things off into crazy land and then being able to pull it back quickly.
Well, also not to mention the techniques that were mentioned earlier about the copy and paste. It's like you create your preset and adjust a few things and just start copying and pasting, and now you've got an entire transition from part to part. It's great.
Yeah, that's a great point, Cody, and that's kind of exactly what I did in the time I spent getting ready for this demo. Is I have another project going which has about 10 different variations of the melody part on it, because I just sat there listening to it or walking around in the kitchen doing the dishes with the blasting and thinking, yeah, I like that melody. So you just put them aside and keep them for later, and you've got something interesting. But look, I hope that was useful. What I've just shown you then is completely on the grid, but it's taking away the predetermination that the grid will be the same across all presets and all parts. And the Vector has a big enough brain to kind of give you a split brain function in that way. You do have to watch yourself with the shift and the previous function to reset on the beat, on the beginning of the bar. But that's kind of a fun thing to play with once you realize that that's there, because you can then use the reset function to kind of tease that a bit. And so you can have, that was a little bit out, and then it snaps back in, and it kind of creates a little bit of movement in a fun way. So yeah, that's kind of what I had to present today. If there's any questions, yeah.
No, thanks, Steve. That was a great demo. And It's funny because when I use what I call the fractional or ratio modes, I tend to go on the higher end and use modulation, and again, trying to get that kind of very off-grid, fast, slow, all the time type of movement where it's always changing. So it's nice to see a demo using that with drum parts, and using 3s and 5s on top of regular 4/4 grid.
Yeah, cool.
Okay,
Great.
so
Well, thanks, guys.
yeah, thanks again. All right, so time for special guest, Brian Horsfield, and thanks for joining us today. I caught a fair bit of your set from the last Freak Boutique, and really enjoyed that, and I gather you have some of that same music to play for us today.
I do.
And your performing name is the Aefonic, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about what this piece you're going to play for us.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about me first. So I'm Brian, as you know. I think probably the name's up on the screen, hopefully. And I play as the Aefonic, as you said, Jim. Thank you for that. I obviously, like everyone, really, we were playing out up until about this time last year. In fact, my last gig my last gig actually outside of my house was in early March for Freak Boutique in Denver last year, and I've been fortunate enough to continue playing through the year, but obviously streaming like we're doing now, rather than actually being there in person. So it's been great, and it's been allowed us to do a whole bunch of different things and explore different avenues, which I'll speak about in a few minutes. But the most recent, apart from this today, the most recent performance was last Monday, as you say. That was Freak Boutique number 46, I think. So there's been quite a few of these. Yeah, the WND guys put these on, as you know, right? And they used to be at this little bar in Denver, and because of course you've played there, Jim.
The setup is very small there, and you don't get a lot of time to set up. So that's one of the interesting things about playing from the house is you can use your full system. You have plenty of time to set up and.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about. What scares me there, though, is what happens when we get back to playing live again, and I have to disassemble everything that we've built up over this last year. But I'll cross that bridge when we actually get there. But yeah, so the set I played last week, and typically we play for about 25 minutes, and then there's an interview with Alex from WND at the end of it, and so you have to put together around 25 minutes worth of music, and that's a considerable piece of effort, really, because I like to put things together. I come from quite a traditional musical background, so I tend to think in ways of songs. And 25 minutes in the old world was half of an album. So you've got to basically put that together and try and maintain the interest and all of those things. So as you'll see in the piece I'm about to play, which is a version of what I did last week, it's all about transitions. It's all about light and shade and doing what you can with the equipment to keep it interesting, but and maintaining that sort of activity for about 20-25 minutes. I won't be playing quite that long today, but hopefully we'll get a sizable piece. And the other thing that I think is exciting about it is, you play it, and I sort of follow notes just so that I don't forget things, because in the moment I tend to forget that I've got oscillators that are already ready to go and I never even turn them on. So I have little notes to remind me what I need to do. And really the effort is all about the transition, going from one piece of the performance to the next piece, particularly if that's going from a rhythmic section into a more ambient quieter section. I like to do with that, hopefully with some sort of finesse. So that's always where the challenges are, and we'll see a little bit of that today.
Yeah, that's definitely always a challenge with Eurorack in particular, is moving between tracks. And when Chris Meyer and I were working together regularly about this time last year actually, he would come over and I had to be careful about the order in which we practiced things, because he would often have to completely repatch the system based on which track we were doing, and we'd set the playing order for a live set, say 3 tracks, and there would be at least one spot where I'd need to, do something over on the side to give him time to do a little bit of repatching. And,
Yeah.
Well, it's just,
and some of the people we watch, you, Chris, Alex Anderson from WMD, you're not scared of repatching on the fly. In fact, creating full patches whilst in the middle of a live performance. Frankly, I'm not quite there yet. I like to have my stuff pre-patched. I do, can move the odd cable around here and there, but that's about it. I sort of need to know that it's all there and largely where I'm going with the thing. So I haven't quite got to that level of skill yet, but hopefully we'll get there over time. Hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, I think it helps to have, you kind of have your base patch with a few variations, and you give it some time so you know where everything tends to be, and and I guess just a fair bit of run-throughs, right? So you tend to make the obvious mistakes at home before you're online or you're at a show.
Yeah, and I think having, I think of the vector, and again, not just to bring it back to that, but, this is absolutely correct. I think of the vector as the brain of my system. So, my stuff is very sequence-based. It doesn't tend to be self-generating very much. It tends to be pre-thought out in that way. It's just the sort of thing that I write. And I utilize the vector as, right at the heart of that, right at the center of that. And when I first started, as you know, I think I've had the vector about 18 months now. When I first started with the vector, I would basically hardly change it. Once it was in a performance, it would be what it would be, right? And I would, just click through the scenes and that was it. But increasingly, I found that I can actually just play with the settings, a little bit like you were just showing with Steve. It's a really flexible performance tool once you actually understand what it's doing and set up your system to make the most of that. You can actually change things on the fly and create a huge amount of interest just basically working on the vector itself. So I haven't done a lot of that, but there is more of that coming into the performances that I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean that's why I tend to keep iterating on the different user actions, particularly with things like the copy and paste that aren't they're a little bit hidden in the UI. They're not right on the surface.
Yeah.
But generally the goal is to keep the UI as flat as possible so you can move around and change things easily. And then the launchpad of course helps a lot because now you've got you can leave it on the session page and very easily change parts, mute parts, move between scenes, so that you have that surface dedicated to those actions. And then on the vector, you can be on part 5 and then muting and unmuting other parts, and basically have 2 options for controlling the system. And I know you have the launchpad in your setup as well.
I have, and I'll be using it for exactly that purpose during this performance in a couple of minutes. I mainly use it for just selecting different parts and. But I find that really, really easy. I also use it a lot now in the composition process as well, because I like to play from the vector through, from the launchpad through the vector into whatever oscillator I'm, or whatever sound making element I'm using, so that I can actually hear it real time, and then I figure things out from that and then put it into the vector as a sequence or whatever it might be. So yeah, I'm using it quite a lot actually.
Awesome. So,
right.
You ready to get started then, or?
Yeah, I think so. I'll just do a quick minute. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to play a little performance now, as we were just talking about. It's a version of something from a week ago. Hope you enjoy it.
Yeah.
And then after that, what I want to do is a sort of a deep dive into my setup here. So just as a precursor to that, to mention that what I've got going on here is what we were calling a hybrid setup. And by that, what I mean is it's predominantly Eurorack, and that's what you'll see me playing, which is behind me. But all of the Eurorack is going into my computer, into Ableton in actual fact. And most of the effects that you will hear are coming from there. So I'll go into that in more detail, but I just wanted to explain that that's what's going on right now. And then we'll do a bit of a deep dive in terms of how that works, what the component parts are of that. I know people on Facebook and so on have been really interested in how to clock this stuff, how you keep everything in sync. I will say right at the outset, there's actually no sound per se coming from Ableton. I don't have any soft synths in there or any rhythms or anything like that. I'm simply using it as the input from the sound from my Eurorack and applying effects to some of those sounds, and then that goes out to my mixer. So there's actually no pre-done clips or anything in Ableton. That's all coming from the Eurorack. Cool. Right.
Awesome.
I just have to do some moving around. I've got my trusty camera person standing next to me here, so she's going to have that now. And I'm going to turn my my volume down on my mic.
That's a nice looking setup, Brian.
Yeah, thank you, Steve.
That's fun.
Yeah, well, and it's the first time that we're giving it a go. So please forgive me if things don't work out. So for instance, just then what you didn't see was the dog nearly knocked the camera out of my wife's hand. So so that was all about. So no matter how much you plan, the dog's gone out now. He's in disgrace. He'll be back. Alrighty. So I'm going to turn this down and we're going to start. Hi there. Sorry about that. We had some video issues there.
That was fantastic, Brian. And you owe your camera person a nice breakfast sometime this week. But
Gin and tonic is
that
what we'll
was-
be doing after this, Steve.
Yes,
That's exactly what
no,
we'll be
that's
doing.
fair enough. That was just beautiful. Your transitions are so they sound so intuitive, but I'm imagining they take a lot of preparation.
Yeah, the dog's just just pulling my Eurorack thing off there. That's okay.
Cats.
Yeah, good dogs, cats. It's all that sort
Yeah.
of thing. Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, the camera went off twice, so I was sorry if things were just left there. Well, I had to turn the camera back on and all of that sort of thing. So
It was only very brief, and it didn't detract from anything.
it was longer here, believe me.
I thought it was intentional because your graphic popped up.
Oh,
Yeah.
did it? Oh, yeah. Well, that's good. Well, that's helpful, isn't it? At least.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm doing a walkthrough, aren't I? Now I need the camera for that. Thinking about it. So
Yeah. I have to say I'm listening here on headphones, and the mix is just incredible. I mean,
Oh.
Yeah.
everything's really clear. There's lots of left-right movement. It's just, this is sort of stuff I love to play in the car on a long drive, and it's just great.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Yeah, put a bit of effort into. There was quite a lot of stereo in that, as you and I had been talking about, Jim. Sorry, forgive me for not looking at you. I'm looking at my camera
yeah,
just
that's
because I
fine.
need
Yeah.
to get this going for this next section. But yeah, there was a lot of sort of stereo in that thing, and I was really keen to make sure that came across, with the streaming and so on. So yeah, let me just change this. We're getting there. Goes on there. I sort of need to do it this way because I need to hold the camera to show what I'm actually
Sure.
showing.
Yeah.
Hopefully that should be on now.
Yep.
1 second.
Also, if we have a link
there you
to any
you
of
go.
your music online, we can post it in the chat. That'd be handy too.
That would be great, Cody, if you could. Yes, there's a Bandcamp. Jim has a Bandcamp link for me. The song that you just heard, or some of it, will be going up there as soon as I've got it finished recording. I'm sort of halfway through that right now. And that's so yeah, that would be good. And there's obviously lots of other things up there that I'd be grateful if people would listen to, because otherwise there's no point. Right, so I'm going to quickly walk through my setup here now, and some of the things you were actually just hearing. So as I mentioned right at the outset, I'll point that away from. I'll point it at me. As I was mentioning at the outset, the setup is a hybrid setup in that we've got the computer. I'm using a DAW. I'm using Ableton. I do also use Bitwig, but I've switched more to using Ableton just of late. I'm not really 100% sure why. But the Eurorack is really the primary focus here. I'll explain what I use the DAW for in a second, but my enjoyment comes from using the Eurorack. I spent many years doing stuff just in the box, and frankly, I nearly almost got out of music because I just got bored with it, to be honest with you. Even though things could sound good, I don't know, it wasn't inspiring me, and that's what actually prompted me to get into Eurorack, and I've never looked back since. I find Eurorack completely the opposite to working in the box, in so much as almost every time I touch it, I find it completely inspirational. It doesn't always go the way I want it to, but it's always an inspiration. And I really look forward to the days when I strip out all the cables and then it's basically there as a blank canvas to use again. I know lots of people feel like that, but I can't wait for those moments. Then you start plugging it in and you just don't know what's going to come out next, and I really like that. Anyway, so. We have the situation that I've got here is I'm going to show you the room a bit. I have a desk here. This is actually a sit-to-stand desk, or sit and stand desk, and it's raised up at this moment in time. There's my computer. But then the challenge is my Eurorack is over here on a different desk. So the ergonomics mean that I sort of work over here when I'm kicking something off on Ableton, and then I've got a whole bunch of wires on the floor which go round behind me, and then go over to the Eurorack over here. And this is also a sit-to-stand desk. I'm standing it right now, and it's basically at the right height for me to play. This is where I spend most of the time actually composing and stuff on here, but it goes back into the computer over here, and then out of that computer as a stereo pair into this little setup over here, where you can see there's a QPAC mixer, and that then goes off to the monitor. So that's essentially how that actually works from an ergonomics standpoint, and I do find the desks to be really useful. The fact that they go up and down is massively useful for me, and because I prefer playing the Eurorack standing up. I don't know why that is, but I do, and so that
So you actually have electric desk, like standing desks.
correct. Yeah, that's correct, Steve.
Beautiful.
This is one here, and it will go down, low enough to sit at it, and I can wheel my chair over. And this desk over here is exactly the same. When I was working, this was my sort of working desk, and I would stand at this literally all day, every day, because I worked from home for about 15 years. So it wasn't a new thing for me working from home. So that's how that worked. So in the piece that you just heard, the door over here was acting as the master clock. And that was actually clocking the Eurorack, and I'll explain how that works in just a second. But the other thing that the door was primarily doing is I've got a stereo pair from Eurorack coming in via an Expert Sleepers ES9, which I'll show in just a sec, and then a bunch of individual mono feeds coming into the door, and on all of those, I have a variety of different effects. So rather than kitting out my Eurorack with lots and lots and lots of effects, which are expensive and take up a lot of room, I've sort of shifted to having the effects inside the door, and I find that works really well. And then what I can do is using things like the MIDI Twister Fighter here, which I was using quite a lot in that last piece. I'll explain what they were doing. I'm able to have hands-on performance control over the effects themselves. So they're not just sitting there as static things like delays or reverbs. Sometimes they are, but I tend to use effects that are a little bit more unusual than that, to create more interest, as it were, and I do that by utilizing the MIDI Twister Fighter to do that. There, of course, is the launch pad that I was using to change parts from
That's the Mini Mark III, isn't it?
It is the Mini Mark III, so it has no velocity, which I do sort of regret. I wish it had velocity, but on the other hand, I was sort of room constrained a little bit because normally I've got my Lyra here, which I use in almost everything, and that would normally be sitting right over here because I want it to hand. And so it gets difficult to get all of the various MIDI controllers in if you're not careful.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. Yeah, I tried out the Mini Mark III myself, but yeah, no, it's a great little device.
Okay, so here's the ES9. Again, I'm guessing most people know what the ES9 is, but you can see I actually don't have anything coming out of it right now because I don't have anything coming from the computer back into the Eurorack. But pretty much all of the inputs, you can see these are the inputs, are in this white area here. They're pretty much all used and go straight into Ableton, as I said. And typically what you just heard, for instance, there was a stereo pair that comes from the WMD performance mixer, which I think is an amazing piece of kit, and is very central to what I do. And that's really the important piece for the transitions, because obviously you're taking things in and out, and I can mute them and all those things. So you got a stereo pair from there. You'd also got a stereo pair from this little mixer here, which is hard to see amongst all the wires. Where is it? There it is. It's the Cosmix. And I use that exclusively for drums and percussion. So my drums and percussion are all over here. So there's a Crater, Chimera, Fracture, and so on. They go into the Cosmix, so I can mix them live. And again, you were hearing me do that, and mute them live. And then I take a stereo pair out of there into the ES9, and then they can be, affected if I want them, put a reverb on or whatever I might want from Ableton itself. So again, that's quite useful. This also has an auxiliary out, a single auxiliary out, which I also take into Ableton, and I put a delay on that typically, and you can then add delay to taste to pretty much each one of the channels in there.
So hang on a sec, you've got the not basic, but you've got the root sort of signal going out, as well as an auxiliary signal, which you could add different effects to and have that kind of in parallel and mix the effect differently, I guess.
That's correct, because there's
really
an auxiliary mix here. Look on the on the thing itself. So yeah, that's exactly how that works. So again, it doesn't come back in like an auxiliary would normally be a send and return.
Yeah.
It doesn't return back to the Eurorack,
There's
because
no
of
need.
course ultimately I'm taking all of the sound out of the DAW, exactly. So it just stays there.
So are you using the ES9 inputs to clock your Ableton effects with?
No, because the Ableton is the master clock for everything.
Oh,
So
okay.
everything is being clocked from Ableton. So by default, all the effects in Ableton are in time, because
Sure.
Ableton is actually acting as the master clock. But thank you, that's a great segue into the next piece, which is, okay, so how do I clock Eurorack then, given that Ableton is the master? So I've tried, as lots of people will know on Facebook, because I've commented on it lots and lots of times, I've tried lots and lots of ways to get a good, strong sync between the computer and the Eurorack. So I've used MIDI in, of course, with the Vector. I've used separate MIDI devices. I've used a whole range of things. And whilst they sort of work, the way that I work a lot, when I'm starting composing something, I will work with samples on my computer, and quite often there'll be multiple drum or rhythmic sort of samples, and they need to be very tight with, say, kick drums working in Eurorack, and so just good enough isn't really good enough, if you know what I mean. It has to be really tight, otherwise things always just sound a little bit off. What I found to be the best solution personally is, unfortunately, is an expensive solution, but at least it works. And that's this chap here. This is the ERM multi-clock. So what I've got here is it comes with a software plugin that you put in Ableton. That fires out an analog signal over USB to my mixer, which is here to my left. This is a QPAC. And then I take an analog signal out of that, which is this cable here, into the multi-clock, and that makes it incredibly tight. So that gives you a really, really tight sync with Ableton. You can then, I haven't had to, but you can then mess around if you want with these knobs here, which will actually change the sort of shuffle, they will shuffle, there are shuffle knobs as well. It changes the sync basically. You can make it go slower or faster slightly if you want it to.
Like an offset feature?
Yeah, exactly right. I believe they're more used for older drum machines and that sort of thing, which can sometimes be off a little bit, and with this way you can dial it in. But with my setup, I've found that I haven't really needed to do that.
Wonderful.
So then coming out of here, you can have one analog out, which I do, and that goes up to PAMs over here. That's clocking PAMs. I don't use PAMs as a master clock. What I use it for, particularly in this particular piece that you just heard, are sending out Euclidean rhythms, mainly to my percussion modules over here, so that you're getting some variety. And what I also do with that, because you can see there's a couple of inputs into the CV here on PAMs, I utilize this quadrat here, this attenuator, which is hard to get to beyond this rat's nest of cables here, to basically dial back or dial forward the rhythms themselves. So I can make them very sparse. It's actually set right now in sort
Hang
of
on a
sparse.
sec, hang on. Let me just rewind a little bit there.
Yeah.
So, yes, you're attenuating the inputs to PAM so that you can control the rhythmic placement of the Euclidean delivery from that, and that's fantastic, because as much as I adore my Euclidean circles, the lack of modulation on it's a bit of a test sometimes. But no, that's lovely.
Yeah, and it works very well. Again, I forgot to do it a lot on that piece that we were just doing, but the idea is as the piece gets busier, you turn it up so the rhythm is more constant, and then as you're breaking down, you turn it down and it becomes much more sparse, but essentially with the same rhythms, and it works really well. So that's really what PAMs is doing over here. And then of course we get to the venerable Vector and Metron. And those amongst you that are watching this, you'll notice that there are no clocks in or out of the Metron, and that's because the multi-clock over here, I take a DIN out of that. That's the red cable at the back there. I take the DIN out of that, and I bring that in to the Vector expander here in the DIN setting. I know there's been all sorts of debates about whether to use MIDI or not. I know it works with MIDI, but I find DIN works great for me, and I might want to use MIDI for something else. So I have it coming in on the DIN setting, and then behind the Vector and behind the Metron, they're linked with a little STG cable or an S-bus. WMD tend to call it S-bus. I think it's called STG on Vector, but they're the same connection, and they pass essentially a clock and a stop-start signal between themselves, and it takes the cables off the front, so it's a bit less clutter on the front, and it works brilliantly. So you've got DIN from the multi-clock coming into the vector expansion. That starts and stops the vector, and at the same time also starts and stops the Metron over here. And I use the Metron almost exclusively for percussion. Well, it's a gate. It's obviously a trigger and gate sequencer. So that's what I use it for. I tend to use it for percussion elements and so on.
And isn't it funny how one elegant decision like that to use that STG or S-bus takes one set of cables away, and in a mess of cables like you've got there, that still makes a big difference because it enables you to have those modules further apart in your rack than you might have had to otherwise.
And you know what? Even just 2 or 3 cables, even though this looks like a mess of cables,
No,
even 2 or 3 cables, as we all know,
makes a
anybody who's ever
difference.
done this, like you're grateful to get them off there and just get them out of the way a little bit. So that's how that works, and that's tight. That's really tight. You know, just again, people have talked about this on Facebook. Is the DIN sync between vector and other items, is it a tight sync? And I can guarantee it absolutely is. And and if you find that you have to change things a little bit, or you need a little bit of variance, and you say you don't have a multi-clock, what sometimes I do is utilize the groove function, as it's called here in Vector, which of course, as you know, allows you to move notes, nudge notes backwards and forwards. And again, if you're really getting down to something precise, like an example would be, say, 2 kick drums playing simultaneously. As everybody knows, you usually end up getting flamming kick drums, which never sounds great. But you can get them very tight like this by using this sort of groove function just to nudge it fractionally if you need to do that. And of course, you can move it forwards or backwards.
And it's worth pointing out that with percussive sounds like a kick drum, with that thwack and the transients and everything, often it's just the nature of the sound that makes it sound like a flam. Because even though they're triggered at the same time, the thing isn't.
Correct.
Yeah, you can explain that a lot better than I did. I don't use technical words.
No, I to weigh in on that, when you have a filter opening and it's got a snap to it or something on a bass filter or something that you're syncing up to your kick drum, I use that groove feature regularly to just, there's that snap lined up with the transient, done. It's wonderful features.
I hadn't thought of that, Brian, so I'm going to go play with that later on.
Yeah, it works well, and necessity drives it, because you need to get those things right. Otherwise, it's one of those things that when you get it right, it sounds great, but if you don't get it right, it sounds pretty amateur. So it's all about getting that correct, as far as I'm concerned. So the vector, as we've said, is the heart of the sequencer. I think on here, where are we? Over here, aren't we? Yeah, I've got pretty much all the tracks are in use, apart from 7 and 8, and I leave those exclusively for drums usually, but I'm not using them in this instance, because what I use are the MIDI outs for parts 7 and 8, or 1 MIDI out, and I link, put 7 and 8 on the same MIDI channel, and then typically that will go to this Vermona DRM1 over here that I've got, but it just didn't get used in this particular piece, so it's not being used today. But that's normally, I normally will use the vector to power that. And what's particularly good about that is that the Vermona doesn't have lots of fancy bells and whistles, but one thing it does have is velocity. It understands velocity over MIDI. So you can, and of course the vector puts out velocity as well. So you can create some really nice parts just by messing around with the velocity and creating some subtlety in the parts. And I've found that the DRM1 and the vector go really well together for that reason.
Can I just jump in there? And of course, speaking of velocity, the latest firmware version that Jim's released actually has velocity sensitivity for inputs to real-time grid recording. So if you do have the Launchpad with velocity sensitive, which you don't, Brian, I'm sorry,
No.
you can actually record that velocity and then have it play out via MIDI, which is good fun. You've got about everything else though, so I'm not going to.
I'm not complaining. And that leads me on to probably
which Launchpad is that?
It's
the Mini Mark III.
Yeah, Mini Mark III.
Okay.
Are we going
do
to
you know
see
what?
a
It
Are
is
we going to
great.
see a sale on Colorado Modular's sales soon?
No, you won't. No, I'll stay with it. I've got enough other things to mess around with without worrying about that. To be honest with you.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, plenty. And speaking of which, the thing that I'm pointing at right now is the Symphonium, which again I know there've been lots of questions about on the Facebook pages. So this particular composition that you've just heard is in C minor. So I set the scale to C minor. Oh no, sorry, B minor. I apologize. It's in B minor. So I set the scale on the vector to B minor. And I also set the scale on the Symphonian to be B minor. And for a number of the parts, the bass parts, well, several of the parts, I can't remember, it's a couple of weeks since I put this together now, but most of the parts, the melodic parts, go through the Symphonian. So the vector plays the the rhythms and so on, and it's obviously in scale anyway, but then that goes into the Symphonian, and then that puts out essentially variations of what the vector is sending it, depending on which of these buttons you have pressed on here, and you can move them around as presets. I was going to do that in this, but I never got around to it in actual fact.
So sorry, I've never used a Symphonian and never watched the YouTube videos, but what do those presets or buttons enable the melody to do? So if I'm taking a melody into the Symphonian, what can I do with it on the output?
I don't know if you can see on the thing here, but all the buttons are marked as root, third, fifth, seventh, etc. So that's basically the notes that they will play. So over here in the window, you set what your scale is, and there's a whole raft of different scales you can have. And then depending on what the buttons are, what buttons you have pressed, it will output those particular notes in that particular scale. And if you're inputting a whole variety of notes from the vector, for instance, it will change the variation of how it uses these. So it will find the closest to the root, the closest to the third, the closest to the fifth, the closest to the seventh, etc.
Right.
And it plays it. And I'm not sure how it does this, and somebody more smarter than me could probably tell you. It plays them in a particular way. So basically it gives you like bass lines and so on. This thing here, for instance, has two roots. So it will switch between a high and a low root, which gives you like a rhythmic bass thing going on. So it's a very sophisticated piece of kit. I like it a lot. I use it in everything I do, but I use it fairly basically, and I think a lot of people are like that because it is, it just does a lot of things. It will actually sequence through various scales and so on as well, and sequence through chords and chord shapes as well. I wasn't using it for chords in this particular instance, but I was using the arpeggiation. I was using channel 1 for bass. And I can't remember what channel 2 and channel 3 did, but they were doing something in there. Everything was going through there.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah.
It's a nice piece of kit. So just a couple of other bits and pieces then. So the first thing you heard when we first started off the thing was actually the Loquelic Terratas over here, which I believe you just got, Steve, right?
I love it. Yeah. So I'd wanted one for a while, and one came up in a local secondhand from a trusted friend, and I'm really surprised by just how good the fundamental waves sound. I thought it was going to be, because you see the videos and it's just big, fuzzy, all sorts of things going on, but the actual fundamental sounds in it are just pretty.
Yeah, I like it. I like it a lot. And again, it gets used in almost everything I do. What was interesting, if you can cast your mind back to the beginning of a piece I just did, it was essentially sounded like almost like an arpeggiation, because it was going, But in fact, that was actually there was no envelope on that. It was just a straight out. Going into Three Sisters over here. So Mannequin's Three Sisters here. There you can see, which is an amazing filter. I love that as a filter. And the modulation that you were hearing was because the Three Sisters was being modulated by, I think this is my newest purchase here, by the Acid Rain Technologies Maestro, which has been
look great.
Yeah.
Too.
It's been getting a lot of press on the internet and so on. There's tons of videos about it. It's only a modulation thing, but it just transforms things. It's been really great. So the movement that you were hearing on that Loquelic Terratas right at the beginning was all coming from the Maestro, because it was actually
Right.
just a single tone with no envelope going into a filter. That's all it was. But the filter was being modulated over a couple of parameters by this
see.
Maestro over here, and that's how that worked. And that was actually the start. That was the first thing I did on this particular piece, and everything else came from that. That's always a good thing. What else have we got? Yeah, so we're getting to the end now. You'll be happy to hear. There's an arbor in here, which I haven't had
Somewhere.
somewhere in there, which I haven't had for very long. I created the drones and so on. I think you can maybe hear it. Yeah, it was actually being struck. So this input here is coming from the Metron, and when it's going, that strike. If I press this, it's like a strike thing, and that's the noise you were hearing because it was multiple striking
Yeah, right.
of the thing itself. So I had other stuff in there that, again, if I felt like it, I could actually change to other tones that I'd made. But I didn't use that today. But again, gives you performance options, and I created all of those tones from soft synths in my in Ableton. So that's where they came from
Right.
originally.
So you created the sounds in your DAW in Ableton and then exported those as some kind of file and
Correct.
played them back in the Arbor and manipulated them. Is that where the little speaking bit came from as well?
No, the speaking bit I stopped. It is a really long piece. It's from a woman who's on LSD. Basically, it's a really interesting.
Oh, right.
It's a really interesting piece. And
I think I've met her, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You said it. Yeah. So, but I had that going through a couple of effects as well. So it could. It didn't just sound like a straightforward, vocal sample, as it were. It's a very long piece, that, so I sort of cut it short because we were sort of running out of time. But the other piece that was going on at the same time, or partly at the same time, that was from Morphogene, which is one of my favourite things, and that was this noise. And this is a reel, and it's going through various elements of the reel, but they're all quite similar. I made them the same way with soft synths. And then basically it goes through, again, because I'm not playing, it's not going to go through them properly because it needs to be triggered. But they're all in a similar character, and so obviously in the same scale, of course. But they do slightly different things, so it gives it a movement and a feel, as you can sort of hear in the background, which creates a great sort of texture to work against, which is
Really
the sort of thing that I like. So
Yeah,
it gives you a lot of
Morphogene's
leeway.
a really intriguing module, isn't it? It's one that I don't use, and then I use it, and it's like, oh my god, I just should use this every day. It's
Yeah, I nearly sold it only about, I don't know, a month ago, and then I just got back into it again. You know
Yeah.
how that goes. You sort
Yeah.
of love these things and then you hate them all at once, don't you? It's
well,
just
I bought that one
the way it
twice, and I'm not getting rid of it again. So,
is. Yeah, so that's the Arbor and the Morphogene, and they're great. And and speaking of samples, I've always loved samples. I've been involved in samples. I actually created. People don't know this very much, but I created one of the first sample CDs. So in the days before you got things on WAV files, or as WAV files, people will. Well, if you're old enough, you'll remember that. I guess it was in the 90s, early 90s. People started putting out, or companies started putting out sample CDs. And I happened to know a guy who owned a keyboard shop at the time, and he specialised in buying and selling classic analog keyboards. So he and I sampled the hell out of them, and put out a sample CD called A to D, Analog to Digital. You can still buy it. We sold the rights to it, actually. It's still available to purchase now, so check out Analog to Digital. And most of that was recorded in my bedroom. I literally shipped through every classic synth in the world through my bedroom from this guy over the space of about 9 months, and just sample the hell out of it. And that started my love for sampling. So no surprise in this kit.
Yeah,
Sorry, Steve.
wow, sorry. Yeah, I remember buying CDs like that back in the 90s too.
Yeah,
It was,
and they weren't
quite
even WAV.
amazing.
There was a CD audio, so you actually
Yeah,
had
that's
to
right.
record it and then turn it into some sort of WAV that you could use. It was a really painful process, but that's what was available at the time. So I've got Bitbox here, which has always been one of my favourite things. It was one of the first things I bought, and it'll never leave my case. It's a great thing. It's the first version, but it still works really well. And I tend to create most of my own samples. Sometimes on more complicated drum stuff, I don't. I'll use a pack for that. But if it's a pad or if it's, you know, an unusual noise, usually I've created it. And the way I work with samples, and there's this one, and then over this side, there's the black box, which I've also got. I'm not using any of the sequencing capability. It's simply acting like a bit box, really, right now. But what I tend to do, the reason I tend to do it this way is I like to have interesting noises, again, for texture and variation, and you can use them in transitions and so on. So they're never like backing tracks. That's not what I'm interested in. So they're always things that just make odd noises, or maybe a vocal noise, or, you know, they just do something differently that's actually hard to do in Eurorack. So that's what I use them for. I use them like as incidental type elements, you know, and as long as they're complementary to the music, it works really well.
Yeah, wow.
And then finally,
What's that right there? What's that black module? Sorry.
This one here?
Yeah, that kind of appealing curve.
It's called a
things on it.
catalyst. I haven't used it very much. You basically set up modulation in this thing using these knobs here, and depending on where the fader is, it morphs between what you've set up. So you have, these are like preset things. Yeah. And you set one for hard one side, and the modulation will be, you know, like this, and you can have all of these modulations out going to wherever you want. And then as you slide it over, it morphs into a completely different set of modulations over here, which might, you know, be on a different thing. It's a really fun thing to play and use, and I was going to use it in this, but I never got around to actually programming it. So
yeah, I haven't seen that before. It sounds amazing for live performance. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. A few people have them. I think the person who made it has not made very many, and he hasn't made another run of it since. So I think there might have only been one production run for this. But
that's all right.
I stand to be corrected on that.
My shopping cart's had like 4 more things added into it since we started talking, so one less one.
Right, and then finally then, the other main thing that was playing through all of this, the thing that I was playing around a lot with, is this thing here. It's the Rare Waves Hydronian, which I've loved. It's a great sounding acid sort of thing, but it's got a beautiful tone. It comes as a standalone synth or a Eurorack modular element. It's essentially self-contained. It's got envelope and filter and an oscillator. I think it's a single oscillator, but it sounds great, and it's been front and center in sort of everything I've done recently. There's a whole bunch of WMD things here with carbon, javelin, that was the envelope that the bass was going through. I have scalpel up there, this thing that's going up and down. That's actually a filter, an EQ type filter, and it's morphing between 2 different filters, and the, you can't hear the noise, but one of the, in fact the last thing I'm going to talk about, the chainsaw, which was making these chord sounds,
yep,
is going through that scalpel, so it was changing.
Right.
The filtered EQ was giving it a different sound as this thing goes up and down. Essentially, when it's towards the bottom, you're getting the lower pitch elements, or you know, the more bass elements, and as it goes to the top, it's essentially a high pass filter. You know, so it's a low pass and high pass filter all in one, really. But it modulates and morphs between the two, which is great. And then finally, I had chainsaw on here with this shifty in analog register mode, and that was sending out this, I don't know if I can actually play it, this noise. So that's all chainsaw. You hear the detune? I guess I could have been demoing it all the way through, couldn't I, if I did that? And that is being modulated again. So the way that sounded like a riff was because it's going into the Vermona twin filter over here. That's what these inputs are over here. But the twin filter is being modulated again by the maestro, and that's why it sounded like a riff. Because if the maestro wasn't there, if I took that out, for instance, and play it, it's just a straight tone. Oh, Actually, I think it's been modulated twice. There's another one in there as well.
Yeah.
But if I put that back in, there you can hear what the maestro's doing.
Very nice.
Yeah, there's a huge thing going on there.
Yeah. So that's just modulating that, and that's about it. I think that was pretty much what you were hearing, and my camera stayed on. So great result.
Yeah, wonderful, man. That was there's so much depth to all of the different sounds, and if I understand correctly, there were only 5 or 6 active parts total on the vector. There's so much happening with just one little brain. You know, it's impressive to see the vector controlling so much as the center of a system.
All the melodic parts are being controlled by the vector. You know, again, we should say that the percussion parts, and there were quite a lot of those, are being controlled by the Metron. Sometimes I do it with the vector, as I mentioned earlier, but I didn't in this particular instance. There wasn't, but everything was Metron and vector, but primarily vector.
Yeah, what a nice pair up. That's great. That's a huge impact.
Yeah. It's it's good. It keeps me out of trouble.
So
Yeah, indeed.
and how many different effects are you using in Ableton? It's hard for me to catalog, you know, how many delays or filters, etc.
It varies. In this particular instance, as I mentioned, I'll tell you what they were exactly because I've got a list here. I had a stereo in from Performance Mixer, and there was nothing on that other than a compressor to keep just to keep things in line a little bit. But there was no, because that was a combination of stuff coming from the Performance Mixer. You know, it wasn't suitable to put delays or anything on it. There was a stereo in from the Cosmics, which as I mentioned to you before, was drums and percussion, and again there was just a compressor on that just to keep things in line. Then there was a stereo in from the Black Box, and I think that was just a compressor because lots of different noises in the Black Box, so you couldn't apply much in the way of effects. Same for the Bitbox. Then there was the bass. I had compressor on that. I also have a delay on that, and the delay was controlled. So I was controlling the volume of the bass from here. This is this. If I play it, you can probably hear it. You hear the bass there?
Yeah, wonderful.
So that's me turning that up and down. But also, this button beneath it was the delay for the bass.
Oh yeah, that's great.
So that's all being controlled by soft effects in Ableton. That's how that works. So this is me using the volume controls here and then effects under here. One thing I didn't mention, the reason why that sounded poor is because I've got this, on the master channel, I've got an effect, a delay which allowed you to do the repeat stuff that I was doing right at the end, and like a fade to grey button, which again is like a high pass filter that takes all the low end out of things. So when you hear things playing, here's bass. When I turn this.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And that's on the master channel. So that affects everything that's going through it. So again, you don't have to be specific to one item. You can actually, do the whole master thing with like DJ EQ type tools and so on, which again is really good from a transition standpoint, and just adding variety and changing the tone down. Getting, instead of everything being bass heavy or bass light or whatever, you can change it around, and I think that's always important.
No, that's great. What a flexible integration. It's so inspiring to see other DAW users integrating Ableton and mixing solutions as your mixing solution, rather. It sounds like you're taking a lot of things in and using Ableton as your mastering device and kind of sweetening the pot, if you will.
Yeah, and that's where it started from, Cody. What happened was I was trying to figure out how to record better, because prior to this, I've simply been recording as a stereo pair, live. Playing my stuff, and if you've made a mistake, you've made a mistake, right? You just have to live with it. And some of the stuff I've been doing has been a lot more complicated. So I stopped doing that. I started bringing things in, particularly things like kick drums and what have you, which are very key and important in the thing. So I could repair it, but B, I could sort of sonically manipulate it a little bit in the mix, which is sort of what I wanted to do.
Sure.
So that's where it actually started from, and then I realized, hey, I can just play live like this. I don't have to do it just for recording. So that's where it all came from.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I really appreciate seeing the computer used in that way, because some folks have this disconnect, like, I don't want to use this machine in my sequencing rig, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be the brain. You don't have to interface with it that way. But utilizing a couple of compressors and plugins and EQ and tonal control, you can almost let it work for you with a few controls, like your MIDI trigger or the trigger fighter, rather.
Yeah.
So that's huge. Yeah, yeah. Congrats.
Yeah,
I like to see that.
exactly. Sometimes people get down on like, oh, it's not really true if you're using a computer. I'm not of that opinion. Whatever makes the music sound better is what I'm interested in. The
Yeah.
However, as I said right at the outset here, what really worries me is as things free up and I'll want to go play out again, I have no idea how I'm going to reconstruct my case just to be a thing I can take down to the local bar and play, because I'll have got used to doing it this way. And not least, I'll have sold most of my effects from my case. So that's going to be a pain as well. So I'll be rebuying effects, no doubt. That's going to be the next thing.
Maybe it's just a Pelican with the QLD and a laptop that
Yeah.
controls your mix brain, you know?
I'll find a way
Yeah.
to do it, but I decided to embrace this and not worry about playing out. I'll worry about that when we all get back to that in the future.
Different problem to solve, and you could always just invite everyone from the pub to your place.
Well,
That
we've
might
done
be-
That's
that.
true.
We've done that before. We have had a couple of parties here where the WMD guys played, and yeah, they were big
Right.
successes. They were great.
Sounds like a wonderful time.
It was. You're all welcome. Everybody.
Yeah.
Everybody in the world.
So, Brian, one more question in case this wasn't covered while I lost internet was the compositional process for this piece. We talked a little bit about it yesterday, and you said you were using some of the generate functions on this.
Oh yes, I forgot to mention that. You're exactly right, Jim. So we all know, of course, that Vector has got a great generate function in it. But as I mentioned right at the outset, I don't tend to think like that. I've been writing music and songs for many years, so I tend to have song ideas in my head, melody lines, things like that. They come to me very easily, and then I try to recreate that in Vector, and that's what I've been doing, or other sequencers. That's what I've been doing pretty much all my life with these things. But in recent couple of months, and particularly with this piece that I just performed, I decided to use the Vector generator function. So all of the bass lines were generated by me. I think it was in the the first acid one at medium level, just generating bass lines on a B minor scale, as I said. And then what I basically did a whole bunch of them, maybe like 20 of them. And I dumped the ones I didn't like, and I think I kept 8, so I could see them all in one line. And then I just did a little bit of work on them where I maybe took out a note or added a note or something like that, something that I thought it needed or it needed changing by. But I found that to be really useful. It was really great, and I'll definitely be doing that again. It came up with things that I simply wouldn't have come up with, so which is probably not surprising. And I also use the what's the function called, Jim, where you change it, the evolving type thing. What's
Yeah,
it
the
called?
evolve. Yeah.
Is it evolve? It's called evolve, and I use that quite a bit as well on a couple of them. So again, I took a couple of notes out of things, and then I used the evolve, and yeah, there was a slight variation. So using launch or using the parts, I linked the parts. Quite a lot of things that you heard were linked, so it will play like an 8 or 16 note sequence, and then move on to the next sequence and loop that 4 times, and then come back again to the other one with some chance operations in there as well. You get a really interesting piece that's easy to put together, but isn't just the same all the time. It just adds that small amount of variation. And for my stuff, that seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, that's wonderful because, if some folks experience things like I do, sometimes you can't just pick a note out of the air and make it sound great. And if you have an idea or a song reference you've been listening to all day and you just identify with that key structure, starting with the generate and evolve features, I mean, you can go to so many new places that maybe you wouldn't have known to have gone before. And it's wonderful exploratory features for me.
Yeah, well, as I say, I'm slow to the party, so I hadn't really used it very much before, but I'll definitely be using it again. It's a great thing, and I'm sure it will evolve over time, Jim. I know you have other ideas, and you've already been evolving it. I know it's got Euclidean generation in there now for elements and so on. So I know that will change. Jim, one question while I remember to ask it: do you have any plans to allow MIDI file import?
I had not considered that. It's tricky because it's a step sequencer internally, so a lot of tricks that are a MIDI piano roll can handle easily, such as overlapping notes, the Vector can't.
Right.
But you know, I have some desktop software that does that. The
Yes, you
numerology
do.
software has that, and it's tricky, right? Because the MIDI file format's pretty open-ended, and you know, you often end up with a clock track and a few MIDI tracks, so the software has to decide how to interpret all that. But I suspect other people will be asking for that as well.
Yeah, well, the question actually came from David Soto, who sort of runs the Colorado Modular Synth
Hi,
Society.
Dave. Yeah.
And he basically said he wouldn't be able to get on here because he's out this afternoon, but he wanted me to ask that specific question. And I must admit, I've thought about it in the past as well, but yeah, I imagine it's complicated.
Yeah, it's a little tricky to do well, and so it's not something I'd really considered yet. But you know, with 2.0 on the horizon, hopefully very soon now, start looking at some new things. And on the generator side, you know, I think the UI area for that is coming up for an overhaul, in the sense that there's of the algorithms that are built in, many of them are designed to kind of take over the whole pattern, to start with a completely fresh slate. But a lot of people, particularly people who've been using the vector for a while, are like, well, I just want the pitches, or I want, you know, Berlin 01, but I want a 32-step version. And so I've been making some adjustments to the algorithms internally to allow them to generate over a longer space. But I also want to, you know, provide a little more room in the UI somehow, that you know, you can say, okay, I want Berlin 01 with all the options on. You know, I want it to overwrite the whole sequence and start with an 8-step sequence, or I want to set my own sequence control settings, so I want a 16-step pattern and I want it in 16th or 8th notes, and then run the generator just for the pitch and gate times. And then some things like Euclidean, where, you know, that's an algorithm where people like to dial in the exact number of you know, the parameters to control exactly which pattern gets generated. So that's something I'm going to be looking at, and certainly I encourage people to send me notes on, you know, use cases they want to pursue. It helps me organize what the UI should look like and how we should get to it. You know, in Evolve too, there are a few parameters there that would be useful to bring up to the UI, so you could dial in the amount of change that's happening, or you could limit the change just to pitch values or just to gate values. And of course, I know people would like to use external triggers to trigger both of those operations.
I guess that reminded me of one thing, and I know this is being asked for, and I know people will resonate with it. Do you have any options to do an undo function? Because there's been many times when I've done this stuff, it's like, oh God, I wish there was an undo function.
yeah. No, we'll get there. The idea is to take one of the presets and make it an edit buffer, and then that way you could, you know, just depends on how we organize the UI, and then be able to back out. But also, you know, that's often a common performance trick, is to manipulate a pattern and then undo the changes.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I do it now. I mean, if I remember, that's the problem, because sometimes when you get all excited, you forget, and then you change it. You go, oh, I think I prefer the other one, but I can't get to that now. It's all done.
And you're right. In the moment, it's not always quick enough to just like make a copy and work on the copy. It's like, I'm in this moment. I gotta spend 10 seconds to, you know. So yeah, it would be nice to be able to back up or undo. But yeah, I hear you on. It's another memory allocation.
Hey, Jim. So Mezzanine Music's just asked, is there a generate function for chords?
No, I did not try and do that yet. That's an interesting option to pursue, you know, and definitely I'd want to work with, you know, people who've done a lot more song composition, like maybe Brian, and think about ways to generate chord progressions that it'd particularly be interesting if we could do something there and tie that with a melody and bass line generation, so that you essentially get, you know, song ideas across 3 or 4 parts at once. That could be pretty nuts.
That would be quite amazing.
Yeah.
My camera person made me a gin and tonic, so I'm very fortunate.
Oh, we're jealous.
Yeah, need to hire that kind of camera person.
Yeah. Okay. Any more? So Brian, feel free to pepper me with questions. That's one of the unique privileges of being the special guest.
I can't remember. I think you always answer my questions online, Jim. You're always very responsive when I'm usually working on something and I can't figure it out and all of that. So that's been good. One thing we did talk about a little earlier on today, which was a question I had, I found that the function where where you chain sequences together, by bar or by beat. I was, as I mentioned earlier, I was using that a lot in this particular piece that we just did, but I found that it wasn't necessarily working like I thought it should work. But I think you were telling me that the most recent beta, which is out right now, addresses that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. There was if you had a playlist running and you kind of manually override it by selecting another preset, it wasn't resetting an internal counter properly, so it would jump ahead when you got back into the playlist part. And that's been fixed. I think that's 1.40 is the one that's currently online.
Yeah, it is.
And then there are a couple of more things coming in. It'll probably be 1.42 with one is a subtle timing fix when changing presets. And then I mentioned earlier a feature people have been asking for with the scenes is that when you stop the transport, it doesn't reset to the first scene. That'll be a preference, and the default will be to not reset to the first scene. And so you can turn that on and off as necessary.
Hey, Jim, there's one other quick thing just going through my mind. I made my own STG cable to go between the Vector and the Metron, but again, I know there's been a lot of commentary about this on Facebook. People were definitely interested in this, and buying an STG cable was a challenge because I couldn't get one, for instance. That's why I made my own, but I'm not very handy with the soldering iron and everything, so not exactly my forte. But am I right in thinking that you might supply these now or something?
Yeah, I have a small stock, maybe 10 or 12 cables in 2 different sizes. If I remember, they're around I don't know, 15 inches and 20 inches or something like that. I'll have to look to dig them up, but I have a few I can sell, and I have to check the prices on that too, but they're available here. And one of the things I'm hoping to do this spring is get a Shopify store online for cables and things, or extra manuals, so when people want to pick one up, they can just go and click and get t-shirts as well.
Aha, I was about to say t-shirts.
Yeah. That's the thing about Printful, which is the t-shirt vendor, is you have to set up a store through Shopify or one of the other sites so people can order direct. So that's coming up on the list. Also on the cable front, these guys, the MIDI to 3.5 millimeter adapters that come with the Vector, it's time to reorder these. And based on early feedback, the idea was that I would order with a longer cable. This is about 15 centimeters between the two. So
definitely.
I'll probably go for a double size. It'll be a 30 centimeter cable, maybe 25. I'll have to look at different case sizes and see what people are interested in. But longer is generally better because then it can hang off the side of the case, where this part is the bulky part, so it's not in the way. So I'll order those probably in the next few days, and they'll show up late March, I guess. And those will be available for people to pick up as well.
Great.
Yeah. So, we've been going for a good while. We have any more questions from the field? Last call.
I think we've got all of the questions, but if someone wants to ping one in that we might not have answered, that would be great.
Okay, and of course, the Facebook user group is very active. That's a good place to ask random questions. For something that's a more complicated support thing, I'd say email me, jim@512.com, and that will get you to me the quickest. And then also next month, we already know Chris Meyer will be the special guest. He's going to be part of SoundQuest Fest, which is the online thing that Steve Roach is putting on with Steve Roach, Robert Rich, Michael Stearns, like 15 other performers. That's online. I don't have a screenshot handy for that, but Synthtopia posted a link to it yesterday, I think.
It's over multiple days, I think, right, Jim?
Yeah, 3 days, and it's going to be a lot of new music. It's going to be a great time.
Yeah, good.
And so we'll be
Nice.
talking about Chris's setup for the pieces he did for that show, or is doing for that show, and some tricks he's been pursuing on the Vector. And also special thanks again, Brian, for showing up and showing us your setup and playing some really, really groovy music. And here is the Aefonic Bandcamp page.
There you
So
go.
let me bring that up so that's nice and big for everybody. So that's the Aefonic one at bandcamp.com. So check this stuff out. Brian, I'm really looking forward to hearing the finished versions of these pieces you've been working on lately.
Yeah, I've got about 3 that I'm getting close to the end of, and then I'll get them mastered, and then I'll put them up there. So yeah, it'll be. I need to get those done now.
Excellent. Well, be sure to let us know on the Facebook group.
I will.
It'll be really a lot of fun. So, okay, guys, I think that's it for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll have the live stream back up with chapter markers later today. Actually, chapter markers will take a couple days, but anyway, we'll see you next month. So that will be the 3rd Saturday in March, which is the 20th. And we'll see you all there. And until then, we'll see you online. So
Thanks all.
take care.
Thanks, guys. Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers, everyone, for joining.